Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode. And today I have a fantastic guest for you today, Sally Holden, and she's coming out of us from Australia. And I'm really happy to have her on the show because she's going to talk to us all about burnout and self-love and women, female entrepreneurship, empowerment. I'm really happy to have her. She's got a beautiful energy and happy to have her. So Sally, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's wonderful to be here with you today, and being able to share hopefully some nuggets of gold that can be really supportive for you, for
Yeah.
listeners.
Well, excellent. So, I love the story origin. So, kind of talk about, yourself and how you got started, and we'll dive right into it.
Yeah. So my story kind of the biggest part of it really started around 2008 when my marriage broke down. My mum passed away shortly afterwards in 2010. And
Mhm.
honestly, it was a really difficult time in my life where I was faced with becoming a single mum. My girls were only 6 and 8 years old at the time. And I figured that I really needed to work things out very quickly for myself in order to be able to provide financially, but more than that, to be able to show up and be the mum that I really wanted to be for my kids. And I had a very clear line in the moment sand. Line in the sand moment of laying there. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was overcome with grief and anger and frustration at my situation. And I was only earning about $300 a week at the time in part-time work. That was kind of where I started from when I became a single mum. And it was like, oh my gosh, this has to change. And from then I dove into Tony Robbins and all sorts of things in self-development to really figure out what was the difference between people that were happy and successful and healthy and had great relationships and all of those things, and other people that perhaps weren't in that situation. And that was my driving force. Was my whole reason was to really create a beautiful life for myself and for my kids. But my girls were my biggest driver at the time. So that took me into all sorts of pathways like kinesiology and life coaching, and lots of wonderful, wonderful experiences learning all about how our mind and body and spirit all work together.
Yeah, and I really, you and me, we were talking, backstage before this, talking about the 6 human needs and, using your emotions and channeling those and using your physiology to empower yourself. Really powerful. So kind of, I've talked to a lot of, guests before you, and we were talking about how the universe conspires to actually move you in the direction. And, one of those things was like, every time I can't make a decision, the universe makes a decision for me in a form of a crisis or some catastrophe.
Mm.
So, what talk about this idea for for especially for female entrepreneurs, they the type A certainty and they get burned out. How do you address that, the symptoms? How do you start healing that? How do you start addressing it?
I think the biggest piece is really understanding the predisposition or the character predisposition behind it. A lot of the women that I work with, and certainly for myself as well, very highly sensitive, very driven, very self-motivated, often was the caretaker in the family in some way, shape or form, whether that was, as an emotional caretaker for people or monitoring, people's emotions and trying to bring harmony and peace within the family, and generally really leans into that feeling overly responsible for others. And often, there can be a lot of anxiety at the root cause of that as well. But really identifying some of those things and then working with or healing the belief systems that is really essentially driving all of that. And for myself in my own journey, and certainly what I've seen from working with thousands of other women, is often there is a deep link or association with our productivity and helping others, which is tied to our perceived sense of value and our identity of who we actually are, which makes it really hard if we want to rest and we want to take care of our body, and then suddenly guilt is kicking in, or we feel bad for, or even worse, we feel valueless or worth less for when we rest, because the value our perceived sense of value has come from our productivity or getting things done. So that is a huge part that I unpack with women, is really helping them to understand those belief systems that keep them stuck in that constantly going back and burning themselves out again, even though they logically might know, but it's those undercurrent or the unconscious drivers, so to speak, that really keep people in that burnout cycle for a lot longer than they need to be. And it's hard when the more burnt out we become, the more we're predisposed to go back into burnout as well. Our resilience becomes less and less in those situations. And setting healthy boundaries is certainly a huge part of all of that.
Yeah, so beautifully said. Because we talk about, setting boundaries and non-negotiables, and I love how you describe this line in the sand moment where it's just like, it's you do or you die. One thing is a lot of Tony Robbins and a lot of people, we talk about this idea of self-love and its impact on life. And so first, a lot of, kind of self-love is kind of used very ubiquitously. So how does it impact various aspects? What is it? What does it look like? What does it feel like? And how can people cultivate this self-love?
I think it is such a great question, because it was the question I asked myself at 31, 32 when I was going through all of my life experiences. And I recognized, I was like, oh my gosh, I've never known how to actually love myself. And I was literally asking, what is it? What do I do? How do I do that? And I think self-love is both a feeling as well as actions that we take. And because otherwise, I had a client years ago that was like, oh, I went and had a bath. I did my self-love exercise. And I said, how did you feel when you were in the bath? She said, I was beating myself up the whole time for not getting the other stuff done. And I went, this is not self-love. It's like, it's really about valuing. And one of the exercises that I normally start with is, what do I like, love, or appreciate about myself? Often it can be really hard for some women if they've never actually really deeply felt that sense of self-love. It can be hard and kind of confronting to begin with. So really just acknowledging perhaps some of the character traits or some of the, it can be actions that we do. What do I like about, I like that I'm friendly, or I like that I smile at others, or I like that I'm helpful, or, any of those things. But really getting to the core of our characteristics and who we actually authentically are as a person as well. And certainly the impact that I've experienced in my own life. I went through 14 years of a very difficult relationship, very unhealthy in many ways. And that was a total reflection of how I actually felt about myself at the time. My self-worth was so low, my self-love was so low, that I was so willing to take whatever breadcrumbs that I could kind of get at the time. And I really felt like a doormat. I felt used. I felt very much in a victim state. And a lot of that was because of how I actually felt about myself. And I honestly believe that was all that I was deserving and worthy of. And so the more that we start to challenge some of these beliefs or some of these ideals that we hold about ourselves, and one of my biggest ones also was that I'm fat and ugly and no one will ever love me. And I honestly believe that as a core truth from 13 to 32, until I learned actually how to start to challenge some of these thoughts that I have had in my own mind about myself. And when I started to realize, oh my goodness, like, wow, it's, that's actually not true, and could really start to just even acknowledge, I like my smile, or I like my skin, or just small parts of myself from a physical aspect as well, because I think that is another challenge that women go through, is there's so much based upon our physical appearance, as well as not only who we are as a person, so, and
Yeah.
what we do. So I think that can be some small ways that we can start to change the relationship with ourselves. But the more that I really embrace these core parts of me, and part of that was embracing my sensitivity, which traditionally, or in the past, I'd received a lot of judgment for, a lot of shame about. And when I really recognized that those parts, that they were actually superpowers, they were actually gifts, and there's no way I could do the work that I do today without that level of sensitivity and without that level of attunement with others. So again, sometimes, things that when we've had projections placed upon us, or, other people haven't been okay with that, really starting to break down those belief systems around what that actually is and how that possibly could be a superpower for you as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, such a beautiful response. And it's quite interesting because it's shocking, kind of you know, how we are so hard and tough on ourselves, but we're
Mm,
gentle and easier on others. Um, and this kind of this whole premise around boundaries and self-love is a lot of a lot of emotional trauma. So talk about addressing the challenges with childhood trauma, emotional trauma, and how forgiveness, letting go impacts those
mhm.
that aspect into developing into healthy emotional beings.
I think definitely from my own experience, really starting to understand what we were praised or rewarded for. What did we receive love for? And perhaps what were we shamed about? Or, where did we lose love or where were we punished perhaps in those situations? Because it's where we will actually hold the most judgment for ourselves. And what I love, one of the processes I use is the Byron Katie work. May be familiar with that or not be, but it's a beautiful way of really starting to look at our thoughts and challenge our thoughts and really question whether they actually are valid or true. And that's certainly the process that I've used to free myself from so many beliefs and thoughts that I've had over the years. Because when we've had those childhood experiences, generally it's been through the lens as a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old, which doesn't have that full adult's perspective even. And so we can have something as innocent as a mum disappearing around the corner when she's shopping, and in that moment we look up, we don't see a parent or a caregiver present, and we register abandonment or we register being left, and that even can register as some form of fear that shows up in the system. And that's not to dismiss or invalidate anybody that's been through really difficult childhood experiences as well, obviously. But our inner critic, and I'm actually running a masterclass on this tomorrow for my free Thrive group, to really understand these pieces, that our inner critic is actually very pro-survival. So it often wants to protect us and keep us safe by trying to make us better and by trying to be more perfect. And obviously, can cause a lot of anxiety and all of those things, but a lot of those belief systems or how hard our inner critic is on us. And unfortunately, it gets very, very loud. The more compromised we are physically or the more exhausted we are, the inner critic gets louder and much more aggressive because it is really trying to keep us safe at the core root of that. So being able to challenge those beliefs is really important in being able to heal some of those things and bring us back to a state of equilibrium inside, and develop that self-love and respect for ourselves as well. Sorry, Chris, I did forget the last part of your question. It was kind of like talking about the childhood trauma. And then, so if you'd like to ask me that last bit again, I can
Oh,
dive
yeah.
deeper into that.
Yeah, I was gonna move on to because again, this concept of letting go and forgiveness is just it's almost like a cliche because people talk about it and they say just forgive or just let go. And if you have if these are
Oh,
deep
yeah.
emotional wounds. So like how do you it's so like basic, but it's like the hardest thing to do. But once you do it, it's like very freeing.
Mhm.
So what does forgiveness and letting go look like? What does it feel like in your words and terms? So kind of just trying to get better grasp
Thank
of
you. Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much for that prompt. So in terms of letting go or forgiveness can be such a triggering word for people because it can sometimes feel like, well, if I forgive them, I've let them off the hook or it's going to happen again. There can be a lot of fear around forgiveness. And I find a beautiful analogy, and remembering that forgiveness is for you only. It's not about the other person. And the analogy that I always use is when we're holding on to anger, rage, any of those things, it's understanding again that that is a very protective mechanism. Anger always arises as a boundary, as a key indicator that this was not okay for me. So it's important to listen, I think, first and foremost to that anger and really acknowledge the anger and also the grief that sometimes can be very interlinked when we've had very difficult experiences. And part of that letting go experience, I believe, is feeling those emotions fully. And that can be difficult and confronting, again, particularly if we haven't actually, or we were shamed for our emotions, or we found it really difficult to feel into our emotions. But what I experienced was the more that I sat with these feelings and allowed myself to feel the fullness of that. So for me, that was like, can I allow myself to feel as angry as I feel right now? And I didn't have to act on that anger, but just allowing that emotion to fully arise within me, and even grief. When I was processing the grief of my mum passing, it was like really feeling the fullness of that. And what I found was it was almost, if I didn't allow myself to feel that, it would be a baseline emotion that I would experience for days on end. Like it would just sit there bubbling away underneath the surface. When I actually really allowed myself to sit and be present with that particular emotion, it actually didn't last for any longer than 5 or 10 minutes. And the relief that I felt afterwards, because what I've learned since is it's the completion of that emotion through the nervous system that's actually creates the stress relief, if that makes sense. Like it's the full flight response or the emotion that arises, and being able to express that or feel it fully allows it to process through the nervous system, and then we can come back into a much more regulated state. Whereas when we're trying to override it, perhaps even with breath work or meditation or any of those things, and I love all of those things, but when we're stepping in and we're doing that too quickly, we're not actually allowing the completion of the emotion. It actually stays stuck within the nervous system. So that for me is the first piece of letting go. And it is just literally allowing yourself to experience it without trying to shut it down, without trying to repress it, suppress it, any of those pieces. The next piece for forgiveness, and the analogy that I used for myself was, it's like holding on to anger is like picking up a hot coal out of a fire and intending to throw it at somebody else. We are always going to experience that emotion first, and therefore we get burnt in that process, even if we're intending to project it to somebody else. And that was when I realized karma, if you believe in karma or any of those things. But I was like, oh my gosh, karma is instant, because I'm feeling whatever I'm expressing, whatever I'm projecting, whatever I'm giving out to the world, I'm actually experiencing that first. And so I recognized that forgiveness really was an act of self-love. And I had somebody that was treating me in a very interesting way for a long period of time. And I would never respond until I brought myself back into alignment. And she actually sent me a message 6 months on and just went, I can't believe I've treated you this way. I'm so sorry. And I don't understand how you were able to continue to respect me, or, treat me the way that you did, even though I was acting the way that I was. And I said, I chose to love me more than I wanted to hate you, because I knew that if I was experiencing hatred or anger, that was me. Actually, that was harmful to me. That was hurtful to me first and foremost. It wasn't necessarily going to impact her life at all, because there was not really much contact or anything else. It was an interesting kind of situation, but it was really such a powerful way of learning and understanding how much our own emotion or what we're feeling or expressing about somebody else often impacts us first. And that's what I love about the Byron Katie work, because those projections are often the unhealed parts of ourself that we need to come back to and heal or question those beliefs or thoughts. So it can be very powerful in a work. Yeah.
Yeah. Very beautiful. And what came to my mind is when you how do you reconcile, because when you sit with the emotion, especially with anger or resentment or hatred or jealousy, or and your mind comes up with stories, it just kind of really horrible stories, and how do you and then it just lingers. What is that, and how do you address that?
That is, for me personally, that's where I would use the Byron Katie work to question those particular thoughts. And it's a great distinction. I'm so glad that you asked that question. When I'm feeling the emotion, I do my best not to think, if that makes it. It's experiencing the sensation of what's actually presenting within the body. So it's like really focusing on the sensation and the feeling, because I know when we're in that triggered state, often we're very much in our head in that moment, or what I call the ego survival mind, which is running a whole bunch of stories. And the more that I started to question some of those stories as well, often, even if I was like felt judged by somebody else, often it was the deeper fear that I was judging myself for that particular thing. So doing the turnarounds with the Byron Katie work, and if you're familiar with that, you'll know exactly what I'm meaning. But generally, it's like they're judging me, and then it would be a turnaround would be I'm judging me, I'm judging them. And it's like, oh my gosh, I'm judging them for thinking that they are judging me. And so sometimes that's just a very simplistic way of starting to understand some of those turnarounds. But I found it a very liberating experience in that there was 99.9% of the time, there was always something that was very relevant about what was within me that I was projecting outwardly or I was experiencing within that as well. So that really made such a difference to being able to, I guess, break down some of those stories and really be able to hold somebody else's viewpoint or somebody else's perspective without needing to make mine wrong or without needing to make theirs wrong. And I think that is a huge challenge that we experience in relationship. And certainly where my mind used to be, it's like I'm wrong and they're right, or they're wrong and I'm right. And what I found was my ego was very defensive in trying to figure out how I was right in that particular situation, as opposed to really embrace and understand both people's perspectives. And I also understand that sometimes people are in such a world of hurt that they will, hurt people, unfortunately. And that's why, the more we can do that inner healing work, I think that's very promotes so much more peace and harmony, and certainly within ourselves, which obviously then just has a beautiful ripple effect.
Yeah, I love that. Just it reminds me just, I love every time I come back home, all these anchors start, all these they kind of reinforce you. But then if you're forced out of your environment and out of your comfort zone, you're forced to choose new anchors. So this idea, like kind of these stories that are not very empowering for you, you can start to break those and shatter those. Like I said, I really love your work that you're doing. And for the audience, how can they find you and reach out to you on socials, contact you for coaching and so forth?
Absolutely. So they can head to my website, which is abundantheartcoaching.com. And I've also got a whole bunch of freebies and downloads, particularly if any of the listeners are feeling burnout, exhausted, or really resonated with that A-type personality profile, high sensitive, over responsible, all of those pieces. I've also got my link on Linktree/Sally Holden. So that's very easy to find, to be able to grab some of those downloads, and it's got my community in there. I also launched my Thrive book. I actually meant to have that here so I could show, but I launched my Thrive, Overcome Burnout and Reclaim Your Energy and Passion for Life the other week, and it went #1 Amazon bestseller in 7 categories. So you could also find that on Amazon if you wanted to check out some of that information as well. It's got some really powerful resources. I'm very much around holistic healing, taking care of our body mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And I'm also a huge advocate of the 4 freedoms that you also talk about as well too, Chris, being, time, health, financial, and location freedom as well. And it's one of the reasons I stepped into coaching instead of kinesiology, to create more of that location freedom as well. So it's a beautiful way. But and Facebook, I'm just /Sally Holden to find my profile there. You can reach out on any of those platforms and send me a message, and we can get in touch.
Yeah, and and I really enjoyed talking with you, and I love your energy, and thanks so much for coming on.
That's absolutely my pleasure, Chris. Thanks so much for having me here, and thank